Hi all, I'm back to do another reading from Daughters of Fire and Sea. Last week we ended with chapter 9 and everyone is on the beach after exiting the Vale, and Runa just did a little fire magic, so that was very exciting. But before I get into it, I'm just gonna say really quickly that if you happen to read my newsletter and everything, recently I had sent it out and I said how much it felt like spring, and I was so happy and ready for ready for everything. And then here in northern Sweden, it suddenly started snowing last weekend, and then it snowed a bunch, and then there's snow everywhere. It's all slushy. We already changed our tires to summer tires, and it's been a time. It was a little disappointing. And like sometimes that happens with fall, spring, and then this comes, but it was just kind of a surprise because it really felt like spring was coming. Like I could see the grass. I was thinking about yard work and everything. So so in addition to the clicks from my heaters in here, you might hear dripping water, and that is now all the new snow melting. So hopefully after this weekend, which it's going to snow more, hopefully spring will be back and then I can resume my walks and everything. Anyway, so yeah, that's I just thought that was unexpected. That was unexpected for this last week. Okay, enough about that. Let's jump into it. So Daughters of Fire and Sea, chapter 10, Elena. Elena watched her daughter, a coldness spreading through her heart, even as her skin tingled pleasurably as magic sang out to her. The fire dancing above Runa's palm reflected in her large eyes. Elena wanted to grab her daughter's hands and smother the fire. Swallowing, Elena forced her hands to remain at her side. "Let's keep on," she said. Runa looked up, regret showing on her face, but she let the magic go and dropped her hand. Fierce pride burned in her eyes as hot as any fire. As they started walking again, Lyric joined Elena. Kel followed a step behind her, as if he'd tied himself to her wrist. Elena clenched her jaw in annoyance. "What are you doing, Kel?" she thought, shooting him a threatening look. His sea-blue eyes flicked to her, then away. He did not fall back with Runa. "I'll have to do something about this," Elena thought. She liked Kel, and trusted him, at least this version of him, unaware of his dormant power and past life inside the Vale. But sometime soon they'd find his mother, or the daughters of Valen would realize who he was. One way or another, the Kel Elena knew would change or die, and when that happened, she didn't want Lyric anywhere nearby. Lyric glanced at Kel with a look of pure adoration, and her pale skin flushed. She'd fallen, as quick and hard as Elena had when their father had shattered her doorstep, arm bleeding from the wolf that caught him in her woods. She couldn't change how Lyric felt, couldn't spare her pain, but she could save her from heartbreak and desolation. She would save her. "How did my mother help you?" Lyric asked suddenly, as if Elena's thoughts had entered her mind. Kel cleared his throat, embarrassed. Elena smiled, unable to keep the satisfaction from her face. Might the story give Lyric pause and make her look at Kel a little differently? Elena looked at him, waiting for him to respond. Someone died," Kel said finally, looking down at the sand. Lyric's head snapped towards him, breath puffing out with surprise. "Died?" Her eyes flicked to Elena. Elena swallowed her smile and nodded solemnly. "Someone was blackmailing me," Kel said. "I got angry, refused to pay any more. He threatened me. We both started yelling. He hit me, then pulled a knife, and we were on a balcony, and I shoved him, and then he tripped, and he fell. I tried to catch him, but he slipped out of my hands. I tried to save him, Lyric, but I couldn't hold him." Kel's face was earnest, his eyes pleading as if Lyric held his absolution. Guilt wriggled inside Elena's throat, and she looked away down the beach. "It looked bad. They wouldn't have believed it wasn't my fault, and your mother helped me, said I was with her, somewhere else. I can never repay her." Elena looked sideways, catching Kel's eyes, and the guilt became a rock inside her stomach. "You didn't deserve to hang for it," she said, giving him a nod. "He attacked you." "Kel, I'm so sorry," Lyric said. Her voice was soft, sorrowful. Elena wanted for her to ask about the blackmail, but her daughter put her hand on Kel's arm. "I'm glad she was there to help you," Lyric said. Elena bit the inside of her cheek and stared straight ahead. "I'm sorry, Kel," she thought, "but you're no good for her." She'd have to find a way to keep them apart after they arrived in Rathor's Cold, and send Kel away. Several hours later, Elena still hadn't figured out how to convince Kel to leave without Lyric chasing after him. They stopped for a quick lunch, resting on large pieces of driftwood, then continued on their way. The dunes had mostly disappeared, the marshland coming to the beach's edge. Though the sand beneath their feet had lightened to a pale gray, peppered with charcoal, the bog remained the same murky black, the islands of grass growing smaller and farther apart as if someone had poured a giant bottle of ink onto the ground to cover them up. Elena wished they had a boat to go across it, reach the northern road, but she knew their oars would stick in the dark muck and they'd be trapped. They had to stay on the beach. Surely Yanessa couldn't be much farther. She was dreaming about a hot bath for her tired muscles when Elena saw a faint ribbon of smoke rising in the air. Was someone on the beach? Had they reached the town? Instincts gave her pause, and she rested her hand on her belt. "I see smoke," Lyric said suddenly, pointing ahead of them. "Are we there?" "I don't know," Elena said. The smoke disappeared, dispersing in the air. It'd come from behind a large dune that hid whatever was beyond it. To the dune's right was a massive pile of driftwood, half submerged in the inky marsh. "Let me check it out," Elena said. "Wait here." "I'll go with you," Runa said sharply. Elena looked back at her red-haired daughter and saw the set of her jaw. "Fine. Lyric? Kel?" "We'll wait," Lyric said, exchanging a look with Kel. Not wanting to leave them alone, Elena hesitated. Lyric gave her a curious look, so Elena grit her teeth and nodded, then began walking towards the dune. Runa, tugging on the straps of her pack, followed after her. They walked in silence, their quickened breaths and the whisper of sand shifting under their feet, ushering them forward. Reaching the dune, they climbed up, using their hands. Elena stopped Runa just shy of the top with an outstretched arm. "Stay low," she whispered. Lying down, they wiggled forward until they could see over the top of the dune. Elena's pulse quickened, her heart throwing itself against her ribs like a startled rabbit. A squad of Sireni waited on the beach below, arguing over the remnants of a fire. She recognized one of the men from the Vale. He had a bandaged leg, and he was gesturing angrily at a white-clad woman standing opposite him. Bracketed by two men, the woman held something in her hand. South of them, another man lounged against a pile of bleached wood. He raised his hand, staring at a trio of rocks stacked atop each other, and Elena felt magic brush across her skin. The ground vibrated beneath them, the stones toppling over. Runa hissed in surprise. The woman turned towards the casting screamer and said something, her hand slashing through the air. The magic cut off, and the lounging man gave a bored shrug. Elena touched Runa's elbow, then began to wiggle backward, as silently as she could. Her daughter followed, and they climbed down the dune. Brushing sand off their clothes, they hurried back to Lyric and Kel. "What is it?" Lyric's eyes were concerned. "Sireni," Runa said. Her voice was tight, and she worried the strap of her pack with one hand. "One of the screamers from the Vale is with them." "What?" Kel's eyes flared. Elena gave a tight nod. "There are 4 of them, waiting on the other side of the dune. They must have realized where we are." Lyric moved closer to Kel, her hip bumping his. "Can we get around them?" she asked. "No. They'll see us if we go in the water." Elena swore inside her head. How could she reach Eladin if they couldn't get to Yanessa? They couldn't wait for the Sireni to leave. What if they started up the beach? She could fight 2, but not an entire squad. "We have to go back north," Runa said, staring up the beach. Kel paled. "Thenda?" Lyric asked. Elena swore again, this time out loud. "Yes," she said. "We don't have a choice. We can't stay here and wait for them to leave. I won't risk fighting them. We'll go back to where we camped, get as much food as we can, and go north." "Is it safe, walking up the shore?" Lyric asked. She looked at Kel, who blinked and looked down at her. "It will be dangerous," he said. "The taint has poisoned the water. There are no cities or outposts for supplies. Some Thendans stayed, so we might find food and shelter, but they may no longer be there." "Are there other dangers?" Runa asked, "besides the taint itself?" "I've never seen one, but I've heard of creatures in the dark." Kel's eyes caught on Elena. Her face paled. She'd forgotten. "I don't know what they are," Kel continued. "Maybe animals twisted by the taint? They are dangerous." Elena nodded. "They'd have to chance running into one. Better odds than the visible threat south. We need to be vigilant." She glanced back at the dune. "We should go before they come this way. We need to get as far north as we can, camp before we reach the taint. I don't want to come across it in the dark." Or the creatures, she thought. She'd have to think about Kel and Lyric another time. Right now, Elena had to focus her full attention on keeping them all alive. Chapter 11. Kel. Dread filled Kel's stomach like rot, growing stronger with every step north, every step home. It was odd how he still thought of Thenda as home after all these years, after leaving it behind. Despite what'd been taken, what he'd lost, walking the shore's black sand filled his mind with sentimental memories. As a child, he'd worked hard alongside his mother and father, fishing the sea of screams that thundered harshly against their eastern border. But even with their struggles, he remembered light and laughter. He couldn't recall a single day when he'd wished he was somewhere else. He hadn't learned to sing in the Radiant Hall as his professors claimed, but around evening bonfires on the beach as he made up stories with his mother Triska. Raised by Triska and Jiri, Kel hadn't dwelled on his origins or worried about the parents who'd marked him and gave him up. His new family loved him, and with the foolishness of a child, he'd assumed they'd be together forever. Storm clouds gathered overhead, shifting across the graying sky as though drawn by Kel's mood, by his fear. The waves, whipped into a frenzy by a ferocious wind, crashed against the beach as though seeking to destroy it. Walking beside him, Lyric bumped against his body as the wind shoved her sideways. Kel shifted her to his other side, away from the sea, trying to offer her some protection from it. Lyric smiled, squinting as hair lashed across her face, and held her hood close. Pulled from his dark thoughts by the look in her eyes, Kel smiled back and put an arm around her shoulders. Together, they struggled against the wind. "Go back," he wanted to say. "Go south. Slip past the Sireni. You can return home." The people needed her there, in Alays Hollow. She could have a good life, a safe life. Kel looked away, feeling selfish as he kept his plea to himself. As the day passed, Kel watched for the taint to appear. His eyes strained as they walked, but the shore continued barren and unblemished. The western dunes were slowly replaced by craggy sandstone cliffs, creeping higher and higher as they followed alongside them, the tops dotted with scraggly bushes and twisted trees. The cliffs were steep, and the soft dirt easily gave way, preventing attempts to climb them. "Where is the taint?" Lyric asked. "Yes," Kel thought. "Where?" Tripping over his own feet, his thought evaporated as he stared at the ocean. Lungs tight, refusing to draw breath, Kel gave a strangled cry. They'd found it. Floating atop the rolling dark blue waves were scummy patches of green algae, poisoned by the taint. "It's there," Kel said. His voice sounded unfamiliar. "Don't touch anything." "What happens if you do?" Runa asked. Kel looked at her, catching her eyes. "It seeps beneath your skin, melting and burning. Your blood turns black. There's no coming back once the taint has touched you. I don't know how the night creatures survive it." Lyric grabbed Kel's hand. Her fingers were tight around his, her skin clammy. "Go back," Kel thought. He looked at her, eyes imploring, but he couldn't bring himself to voice the words. Despite the risk to her family, he wanted her with him. "I'm selfish and horrible. I'll never deserve you." "Walk carefully," Elena cautioned, unaware of Kel's inner conflict. Kel squeezed Lyric's hand, and they moved closer behind Elena and Runa. He watched the water as they walked. Carried onto the beach by the waves, numerous clumps of green algae stained the sand, smelly and clotted like day-old porridge. It became impossible to walk in a straight line as they carefully stepped around algae, dead fish, and crabs, their bodies covered in wet black sludge. When they came across the bloated corpse of a seal, Lyric pressed a hand over her mouth and turned away. The smell of rot filled the air, making it uncomfortable to breathe. "It hasn't gotten better." Kel's voice was hollow and bleaker than he'd intended. "Has it spread? Gotten worse?" Lyric asked. "I don't know," Kel said. "I thought it might die out or sink beneath the waves." "It's drifted farther into the sea," Elena said, looking out at the ocean. "I saw it on Elodin's ship." "Why hasn't it spread to Rendashar or south where we camped?" Runa asked. "Why does it stay here?" "I don't know," Elena said, her face grim. "It doesn't make sense." Dread returned to Kel's stomach, and he tugged Lyric closer, drawing strength from her presence. He glanced left, over the top of her head, and saw that the cliffs had changed, the sandstone shifting to a darker, harder stone. The rock towered over them, casting shadows on the beach. The stench of decay was strong. Kel could see green veining running through it, oozing as if the rock had melted like sun-warmed butter. Memories of pain, confusion, and horror tickled his mind, and Kel shoved it down, trying not to think of anything, trying not to open the door inside his head. "What do we do when night falls?" Runa asked. Her red hair glinted as she glanced back at them, tracking Lyric's progress with her hawk-like eyes. "Maybe there's an abandoned building ahead," Kel said, "a fisherman's shed that hasn't yet been destroyed by the taint." "I pray we find something soon," Lyric murmured beside him. It was early evening when Kel saw the first abandoned city. Cut into the cliffs, the houses were stacked atop each other, rising towers into the darkening sky. Jagged and broken as they were, the buildings reminded him of the points of a damaged crown. Staircases that once led up from the sand into the bottom balconies had crumbled away. Whole terraces had melted into each other. the rock dripping from one house to the next like candle wax. Windows set into the green-veined stone gaped empty and black. The green rot was everywhere, winding through the chiseled stone like a network of vines. Cratho, Kel breathed. This was Cratho. Though hours south of Salta, where the devastating event that released the taint had occurred, Cratho hadn't escaped the horror. Kel had heard stories of stone cracking, erupting, people screaming and dying. It was like the wind carried it down the length of the shore. It was in the sand. Pain lanced across his throat, and Kel reached for it, instantly clearing his mind. The tattoo squeezed like a fist around his neck. Lyric, sensing his distress, helped steer him around chunks of melted stone in the sand. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Her hand was warm on his arm. Kel saw the face of his mother. She was screaming, reaching. "No," Kel said. Lyric slipped her arm around his waist and pressed her head against his arm. "There!" Runa yelled ahead of them. "A light!" Kel looked up, relief flooding through him. He could see a fishing cottage lit by a single orb lantern. Encircled by a balcony, the house was raised high above the waves on reinforced stilts of metal and wood. "Someone's there," Kel said as he stared at the light. He was surprised someone was still living here, especially after what they'd seen. How were they surviving? The door opened as they drew close, and a woman stepped out onto the platform. She leaned against the railing, watching them. "By Ethathera's name, safety and food to you on this dark night," she called. Her voice rasped unpleasantly like a knife against stone. "It's not safe to be out in the dark. Please, come share my firelight." She shifted back and lowered a ladder, gesturing at them to join her. "Can we trust her?" Lyric asked hesitantly, her voice pitched low. "She's not a creature, is she, in disguise, like the flesh-eater?" "No," Kel said, with more confidence than he felt. "That'd be impossible, wouldn't it? Flesh-eaters didn't exist outside the Veil, and the creatures that terrorized the shore were incapable of changing themselves." "No, the creatures here don't pretend to be human," Kel said. "I'm sure we're safer with her than out on the beach. Vendans are always kind to travelers. At least that was our way." "I sense no danger," Elena said cryptically. She stepped onto the ladder first, climbing gracefully to the platform above. Kel, following behind Lyric, tried to let Runa go ahead of him, but she waved him away with a snort. He stepped up to the ladder and put his foot on the bottom rung, steadying it as Lyric climbed. He could see poisoned algae floating in the water nearby and scattered across the sand, but there was nothing directly beneath the woman's house. The water and sand were clear, as though it had been swept clean. Kel steadied the pillars holding up the woman's home and was relieved to see they were undamaged by the taint. How did she do it? How did she prevent it from crumbling like Cratho? Lyric called down to him, and Kel climbed up the ladder, his eyes moving across the beach. He looked for movement in the darkness, but saw nothing. At the top of the ladder, Kel stepped onto the wide balcony and moved to the side where Lyric was waiting. He smiled at her, brushing a strand of hair off her cheek, and then turned to look at the woman. Tall and thin, she wore worn gray trousers and a simple blouse with long sleeves. She was old, maybe 80 cycles, but her spine was straight and her pale blue eyes clear as she studied each of them in turn. Once Runa joined them on the platform, the old woman quickly pulled up the ladder with surprising speed and strength. She waved away Kel's offer of help and, folding it up, tied the ladder to the railing. "I'm Mera," the woman said, straightening. Crossing to the door, she wrenched it open and gestured for them to enter. "A storm's on its way. Please, come inside." The fishing cottage was warm, heated by an old black stove in one corner and lit by 2 lanterns hanging on the wall. Besides the door they entered through, there was another closed door facing the cliffs that presumably led to a bedroom. A rocking chair sat next to the stove with a shabby gray blanket draped across one arm. Bracketed by 2 plank benches, a battered wood table sat in the center of the room. A handful of bird bones lay scattered across its surface, and Kel drifted closer to look. Was Mera casting bones? Kel wondered, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. He watched her clear the bones from the table and walk past a tall cabinet. Kel's eyes dropped to an old chest sitting beside it on the floor. Scratched glass orbs, a familiar dark green, balanced atop the closed lid. A coiled fishing net rested on the plank floor beside it. The items were familiar and reminded him of his life before, of his father. Swallowing, Kel spun away, nearly hitting Lyric with his arm as he looked for something else to focus on. His eyes found the windows, and he stared at the waxed gray paper tacked across the openings. The shutters were closed, but he could still hear the wind howling outside and the rush of water rolling beneath his feet far below. "Sit," Mera said, somewhere behind him. Kel felt Lyric gently touch his back, and he turned around. She set her pack on the floor against the wall, along with Elena and Runa, so Kel did the same before sitting down beside her at the table. Elena introduced them, first names only, as Mira pulled cups from a shelf near the stove. She took the cups when the old woman handed them to her, along with a plate of freshly baked hand pies, and set both on the table. Mira grabbed a kettle from the stove and raised it with a questioning look. "Tea?" she asked, her eyes moving between them. Kel nodded, and Lyric, Runa, and Elena murmured their grateful assent. When she'd served them, Mira seated herself in the rocking chair with a long sigh. "My bones are old," she said, smiling. She reached for a cup of tea she'd poured for herself and left on the edge of the stove. "I feel the storms more strongly now than in years past," Mira said. She caught a glance between Lyric and Runa, who were considering the hand pies, and laughed, her eyes crinkling. "Don't worry," Mira said. "The pies are filled with bird flesh from the gulls that fly the skies. It's not the softest of meats, but it's clean, free of the taint, and it fills your belly." "My mother made gull pie a few times," Kel said, "when fishing was bad." He reached for a hand pie and took a bite, chewing slowly, thinking about the taste and not his mother. "Ah," Mira said, "I thought you had the look of a brine-born boy." Something dark and lost filled her eyes, and Kel's pain surged in response. Mira understood. She'd lost someone here, too. Lyric picked up a hand pie and took a tentative bite. "It's spicy," she declared with surprise. "Yes." Mira's eyes twinkled. "Helps hide the taste of the gulls. Good for digestion, too. So," she glanced between them, her eyes settling on Elena, "what brings you to Thenda? Hunting for treasure?" Kel thought Mira gave him a quick look of disapproval. Did she think he was helping them loot their dead? "If scavenging is your game," Mira continued, "I should warn you, no one who's entered our lost cities has come back out again." She eyed their packs piled against the wall. "Though it doesn't look like you're prepared for much of an expedition." "No, we're just passing through," Elena said. "We're on our way to Rendishar." "Ah," Mira said. "Visiting family? I'd wager you're not merchants, as you're traveling quite light." "Yes," Elena said. Her face was relaxed, unthreatening. "Family." Mira nodded, eyeing her. "You came from the south? It would have been easier and safer to travel inland along the northern road or by passage on a Sereni ship, though I suppose they don't stop in Rendishar and ports anymore." "Did they ever?" Lyric asked curiously. "Occasionally," Mira said. "Trade agreements have been attempted before, despite the war. Did you know they once ruled together on the Council of Men? I'd speculate that the tension between them is what caused the Council's dissolution in the first place." She studied Elena as if expecting an impassioned rebuttal. "We had no choice but to head north on this route," Elena said. Mira seemed a tad disappointed by Elena's response and raised her cup beneath her nose. "Oh?" she said. Elena smiled placidly and sipped her tea. "We were surprised and relieved to come upon your light. Are there others who still live along the shore like you?" "A handful," Mira said, "but we've had bad storms lately. I wouldn't be surprised if they've all moved on by now." "How do you keep the taint away from your pillars?" Kel asked. "I notice there's no trace of algae beneath your house." "Ah," Mira said, eyes crinkling. "I've learned a few spells over the years. I have to regularly clear the sand and strip the algae from the water beneath the house. It's ceaseless work, but if I were to stop, I'd soon lose my home. If the algae touches the pillars, it will rot through in a matter of days." "And the night creatures?" Lyric asked. "They don't bother you?" Mira pursed her lips. "They sometimes come, scratching and moaning like ghosts outside my walls, but they've yet to tear through the wood." She glanced at Elena. "They eat magic, you know." "Spells?" Lyric asked, eyes wide. Mira nodded. "They enjoy flesh, too. Best to avoid them." Lyric sat down, her half-eaten pie. "Why stay?" Runa asked. Though her brows furrowed in an unnerving way, her eyes gleamed with curiosity. "I lost my family here," Mira said. The wrinkles in her face seemed fathomless as her smile slipped away. "They're gone, but I can't leave them." She shrugged, her eyes finding Kel. "I'm old, and I've lived a full life, witnessed many sunrises and sunsets, slept through some storms here that'd blow you across the continent if you weren't tied down." Mira chuckled and looked down at her hands. "Do you ever travel to Rendishar?" Elena asked. "For supplies?" Mira nodded. "Yes, once or twice a season to supplement the food I get from the sky, but I only go to Avern on the border." Mira grimaced. "The land is too hot, too sharp. The sea is different there."
The wind screams at the land as though carrying the Sirenes' voices, amplifying their displeasure. It's a shame you didn't see Thenda before the taint, Mira said. It was beautiful here.
Her face warmed and she nodded at Kel.
You remember, the air was always fresh, the fish fat and savory.
It had been beautiful. Kel looked away from Mira's joy-filled eyes and looked down at his lap. He laced his fingers together, squeezing until distracting pain rippled across the bones beneath his skin. Lyric, sitting beside him, tentatively laid her hand on his knee and squeezed softly. Kel looked at her, surprised and moved by the gesture. He enlaced his hands and covered hers with one of his own. I'm getting too used to this, he thought, being cared for by someone. Runa's voice drew his head back up to the conversation around the table. Are we far from the border? Runa asked. Kel looked at Mira. Considering where they were, he'd estimate the border was only a few days away, unless the storms or the taint had drastically changed the land. Mira eyed him, perhaps seeing if he'd speak up, but when he didn't, she looked at Runa and answered.
I'd say a day and a half, perhaps 2, depending on your pace and the weather. After bad storms, it becomes near impossible to walk the beach without stepping on tainted kelp and dead animals torn from the ocean. The storm tonight might stir things up, but it doesn't sound bad yet. Do you agree, Brineborn boy?
Mira asked suddenly. Kel blinked, his heart skipping. Yes, he said, but it's been a long time since I've walked the shore. Mira nodded.
Most everyone who survived left. I don't blame you. It would have been hard here on a young lad like you.
Kel felt a flash of annoyance. He wasn't a child, not anymore. He'd likely traveled farther than she ever had, seen things she could only dream about. Kel probably knew more of the world, and yet Mira had stayed. She hadn't abandoned their home, hadn't fled with the others. Anger slipping away, guilt rushed in, sharp and bitter. He deserved her disgust. When was the last time you traveled to Avern? Runa asked. Mira cracked her bony knuckles, looking thoughtful.
Right after the winter chill. I missed my usual trip after hurting my leg. I'm fine now, but I'll likely have to head north again in several weeks. There's only so much gull meat you can eat before you crave something else.
She chuckled. Is there anyone we can stay with along the way? Lyric asked.
Ben is about a day's walk, Mira said. He lives close to the cliffs, out of the reach of the sea. I don't know if he's still there, but if he isn't, you can take shelter in his house. Safer than risking the beach at night. I can send dried gold meat with you, and you're welcome to as much water as you need.
Mira gestured at a barrel in the corner.
Gathered from the sky and purified with an old Olaporian method. I'm afraid I don't have more to offer.
That'd be wonderful, thank you, Lyric said. I know a way to purify seawater, but I've been afraid to try since we came across the algae. Kel squeezed her hand, and Lyric glanced at him, smiling in a distracting way. Mira nodded.
Best to get water from the sky. No matter what spells you have, it's not safe to take water from the sea. Not here.
She looked between Elena, Lyric, and Runa.
Traveling here would be safer if you weren't mages, she said.
Kel narrowed his eyes. What was Mira implying? Runa raised an eyebrow. You're a mage. Mira smiled, an unreadable look in her pale eyes.
Not exactly.
What does that mean? Runa demanded. Chuckling, Mira sipped from her cup.
Nothing sinister, dear girl. Knowing 1 or 2 spells doesn't make you a mage. There's skill involved, the ability to quickly pick up the language, and to understand how to create and not just repeat other spells. It took me quite a while to learn what I know.
She shrugged.
Maybe that's what's kept me safe from the creatures. They can't sense the power in me since it's just a trickle.
Mira glanced at Elena.
You, though, should be careful.
Kel thought about Elena moving the 4 of them into the veil and steadied her face. She had to be strong to do something like that, stronger than he'd realized. What might that mean for Lyric and Runa's abilities, their potential? He'd been so sure the daughter's omen was for him, but what if it was Lyric who was in danger? She didn't know her power yet. Lyric pulled her hand away to drink her tea, and Kel shifted his hands back into his lap, heart racing. We'll be careful and find shelter before nightfall, Elena said. If we find Ben's home, we'll stay there. Mira nodded.
Good,
she said. She eyed Elena over the rim of her cup.
How did you end up south of the shore on the other side of the marshes?
Kel's heart skipped, and he looked at Elena. We were traveling with some merchants who, regrettably, were less than honorable, Elena said. She shared a grim look with Runa, who looked appropriately outraged. The plan was to take the northern road, but as you can see, we had to adapt. My girls are safe, though. That is all that matters. She eyed Mira, a challenging look in her eyes. Lyric cleared her throat. Can we stay with you tonight? She asked. Kel knew Mira wouldn't refuse, not after feeding them, and indeed the old woman nodded.
Of course, my dear. I'm sorry for your misfortune, and pray that the remainder of your journey will be swift. I don't have spare beds, but you're welcome to sleep here wherever you like.
Mira gestured about the room.
It's warm, and nothing comes in that I don't allow.
Kel thought back to her statement about magic and wondered what, if anything, she'd be able to do if one of the creatures did break through. A window shutter rattled, and Kel glanced at it, feeling unsettled. Just the wind, he told himself. He looked at the curve of Lyric's cheek. How would he protect her without his staff? He'd lost 2 in such a short time. If their situation weren't so worrying, he'd laughed out loud.
My bones are telling me to sleep,
Mira said. She groaned as she pushed herself up out of the rocking chair. Elena, Runa, and Lyric stood and began to clear their dishes. Standing, Kel curled his fingers around the table's edge. Maybe we can move the table and make room on the floor to sleep, he suggested. Mira nodded her assent. Returning to help, Elena, Runa, and Lyric helped Kel shift the table towards the door, blocking it. They moved the benches out of the way beneath it, clearing a space in the center of the room. When Kel turned back around, he saw that Mira was adding wood to the stove. She closed the heavy door and turned the wire-wrapped handle, then took a lantern from a hook on the wall.
May your dreams be light,
Mira said. She opened the door beside the cabinet and stepped into a small room. Kel briefly glimpsed a narrow bed before she closed the door behind her. Elena and Runa began to prepare themselves for bed, and Kel looked for a place to sleep. He picked a spot on the floor farthest from the stove and sat, leaving the warmest areas for the women. Lyric moved towards him, watching with bright eyes as he shifted his cloak around his shoulders. Kel looked up at her, unsure if he should wait to lay down. I noticed that Mira isn't silenced like you, Lyric said softly, kneeling beside him. A chill skittered across Kel's back, and he nodded, trying to keep his mind clear of Salta's destruction. Yes, he said. Why you, and not others? Lyric asked. Her brow furrowed as she studied Kel's face. Might others have also witnessed what you did? I don't know, Kel said. I left right after it happened. Why did you? Lyric made a face and put a hand on his arm. I mean, I think I understand, but... Why did I leave when others chose to stay? Kel's chest tightened, and he looked at his hands, clenching and unfurling his long fingers. I was scared, he said, after a moment. He didn't like how small his voice sounded, or how helpless he felt. I had no one. Everything was in chaos. I stumbled upon a merchant several hours north of the city. He'd seen the aftermath, a big flash of something far away. He took me with him to Corsicania. I knew my mother had studied at the Radiant Hall before she met my father, so I sought shelter there. Lyric nodded, a lock of hair slipping across her face. Distracted, Kel reached out and brushed her cheek, smoothing her hair between his fingers. You're beautiful, he said softly. If he focused on her eyes and her smile, he didn't have to think about the past. Lyric flushed and ducked her head, but didn't pull away. Someone cleared their throat, and Kel jerked back, looking away from Lyric with a startled expression. Elena was staring at them, her face displeased, her hands on her hips. Maybe you should sleep next to Runa by the fire, she said to Lyric. Mama, Lyric said. She stood, back straightening, the flush in her cheeks darkening in color. I'll sleep here, Elena said. Shuffling Lyric to the side, Elena spread out her cloak on the floor next to Kel and laid down, turning her back to him. Lyric bristled and her eyes narrowed. It's not worth it, Runa called from beside the stove. Lyric glanced at her sister, then at Kel, and gave him an embarrassed smile. Good night, Kel, she said. Good night, Kel said, smiling back. He watched her as she stepped over Elena and spread her cloak next to Runa. Glancing at Elena's back, Kel lay down facing the door. He stared at the table and benches that blocked it, and wondered how much resistance they'd provide against anything intent on coming inside. We're safe, he told himself. Lyric is safe. And I think we will stop there. My throat is feeling a bit, with giving Mira that, with trying to portray a rasp to Mira's voice. And now I kind of regret doing it, but it just felt weird not attempting it, since I envision her voice really, really raspy. So hopefully that didn't make it super, super hard to actually understand what I was saying. If so, I'm so sorry. Yeah, usually I don't attempt to do any type of modify the voices too much. But yeah, I just thought I would try and never again because most uncomfortable. But anyway, Actually, I guess I will have to do it next reading because we'll see Mira a little bit more before they keep traveling. So anyway, yeah, the adventure continues. We now know more about the Taint and which the Tainted Shore as well, which used to be Thenda. Anyway, yeah, it's kind of fun because I'm currently working on the third book now, The Demon Queen, which finishes the trilogy. And Runa is about to return to Thenda, and so it's kind of fun to write this scene since we spend some time there in this book, but also we don't get to go into those ruined cities. So anyway, it's fun. Yeah, well, I'm gonna go drink a bunch of water now, and I hope that you have a great weekend. And I will be back next week to read the next chapter, chapter 12. So yeah, thanks for watching and see you next time.